said, we're starting our study of that great book of Judges. You know, it's interesting. It's going to be an interesting comparison as we go along to compare and contrast Joshua versus Judges. We've all studied both those books before. We just finished up on a study of Joshua. And one of the things we saw in Joshua was what I would call a recipe for success. The time duration of Joshua, as we discussed before, we don't know exactly what it is, but we've got a pretty good idea that the time that it took for conquest of the land, destroying the enemies to the extent that they did, it took about how long?
7 years.
7 years. And then there was a peace, there's a period of relative peace, the duration of which is not given to us specifically, but we think that the duration of the book of Joshua was somewhere between 15 to 25 years. All right. But what success do we see that was claimed by the children of Israel during the time of Joshua? What did they do that God told them to do? The main thing is what?
Follow him.
Follow him. Took possession of the land. God says, I promised your forefathers that I would give you this land, and now he says, go take possession of the land. And so they obeyed him. They went in and they took possession of the land. God told them to do what with the indigenous people there?
Destroy them all.
Destroy every one of them. How good a job did they do on that?
Not to.
They got a fair. They got maybe a C- on that.
That's what
But God doesn't grade on the curve. I think God ultimately would say you get an F on that. You wiped out a lot of them and you took possession of the land, but you didn't obey me completely. And we're going to read what the consequences were. But by and large, we saw tremendous successes in the book of Joshua. The principle of which is what? Not just taking possession of the land, but they had great military victory while they were there. The first one was what?
Jericho.
Yeah.
Battle of Jericho. Using very unorthodox military practices and procedures, right? God said, do what? Get your armor, get your best men, put them out front? No. He says what?
March around the city.
March around the city, and when you've done it 13 times, then do what? Do attack?
Blow the horn.
Blow your horn and shout. And then what happens?
The walls come tumbling down.
Total victory. Total victory. All right, so they had tremendous success.
Yes.
Everyone in Jericho was destroyed except who?
Rahab.
Rahab and her family, that's right. Everybody else was wiped out. All right, what was the next battle after Jericho?
Ai.
Battle of Ai. How well did they do on that?
Not good because they didn't talk to the Lord about it.
Exactly. Two things, as one said, they didn't talk to the Lord about it, but number two, they devised their own battle plan, right?
Yes.
They said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to select a certain number of people, and we're going to go, and we're going to attack, and we're going to be just as successful as we were before, and they weren't. They were defeated, they were humiliated. And so, just in those two battles, we see recipes for success and recipes for failure. And as Wanda said, one of the principal keys is what? Wait on the Lord. Wait on His instruction. Every battle that we face, there's a tremendous lesson there for us. Every battle that we face, what should we do? We should be first seeking the Lord, but we should be waiting on His timing. Now, how often, in your life, how often is God's timing consistent with your timing? Not very, right? We always make our own plans. We put together our own schedule and calendar of events, and we do that, and then God just laughs at us because He's got His own time schedule for doing what He's going to do. But ultimately, God is never late. He does things in His time, and we're continually told throughout Scriptures to wait on the Lord. If you ever go through and just count the number of times that we're told to wait on the Lord, you think we've learned the lesson eventually, but we don't learn it very well, do we? So anyway, in the book of Joshua, we saw success, we saw failure, but one of the great things we saw is that the children of Israel took possession of God's promises. And remember, one of the things that Moses told them, once you get into the promised land, what I want you to do is I want you to stop, and I want you to have a solemn ceremony, and I want you to reflect on the fact that I am a God who fulfills His promises. And what a great admonition that is for us, that we need to just stop at times and just go into our quiet time and recognize and thank God that you are a God who fulfills your promises to us. And he does that 100% of the time. Things don't always go the way I want them to go. They don't always go according to my plan, but they're always going in accordance with God's plan. And we need to acknowledge that he is a God who keeps his promises. And then, of course, one of the greatest expressions we have at the end of Joshua's life, because this is something that you're very familiar with in Joshua chapter 24. He's coming to the end of his career, if you will, the end of his life. And he admonishes the people, tells them about history, but then in verse 14 he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord," he says, "choose for yourself today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorite, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The important thing that Joshua tells the people, just like Moses did before, Moses' career was over. Moses said, "I call heaven on earth to witness against you today that I've laid before you," what? "The blessings and the curses." So he says, choose life. Choose life. And he admonishes them to choose. He says, you've got the right to make a choice. You have the power to make a choice. Make a choice and make the right choice. And Joshua is basically saying the same thing. He says, you've got a choice whom you will serve. You can serve the gods of the Amorites. You can serve the gods that were worshipped over in Egypt. Or you can serve the God who is the God of your history and who is the God who made promises to you and the God who has fulfilled all those promises to you. So he admonishes them to do that. And if they had only taken his advice, then we wouldn't have this long story in the book of Judges, would we? Judges is a very interesting book. Before we get into the message of Judges, one of the things that we always talk about when we get into a book is when does this story take place, the book of Judges? When does it take place and how long does it go on?
Right after Joshua.
Right before. Okay, good for you. Well, Anna, if you had just said that earlier, we could have done away with all this lesson. Our good part.
Page 376.
Okay, I'm really talking about If you write that down on your final exam, all I can say is you better bring some biscuits to the teacher.
Boy, that again.
That's right. So that's it.
And the teacher is capital T.
I was, as I was going through Judges, I made some notes, as you may have made in the past, of how long the children of Israel were under oppression before a judge came along and how long they had a period of rest. And I got most of the way through it, and then I opened up one of my other reference books and I had this chart there. So this chart is a lot neater than what I wrote down, so that's why I copied this for you. But you can see a couple of interesting things about this. For example, you see in the left column, the first line is the oppressor, and there are many oppressors to the children of Israel. The second column, years of oppression, that's the total number of years that each one of those oppressors oppressed. And the total at the bottom is 111 years of oppression. Then if you look over the next column, you have a list of judges. Now, if I had asked the question before we got into this, how many judges were there? What would your answer have been?
10, 12, I guess.
Yeah, 12 is kind of the number that sticks in your mind. 12 is consistent with like the 12 tribes and then the 12 apostles and whatever. But the number of judges is sort of like the number of commandments. We call it the 10 commandments, but you can get 9 or you can get as many as 13 commandments. So here's a list of all the major players of the book of Judges. And if you count them here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14.
Isn't Samuel a judge?
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Samuel was considered a judge as well as a prophet, but he's in another book, right?
Oh, you're talking about in this book.
In this book,
Oh, I understand. So, Greg, help me understand. Is a judge, were they only God called them up when they were being oppressed, or did they have them going on throughout this time? I mean, they kind of lived by themselves, these tribes, right?
Right.
God would raise Gideon, Samson, so forth like that, to help unite the people.
Yeah.
Or did they have them even in the times of rest?
I think they had them in the times of rest. They were just not active. Again, the role of the judge was to be the deliverer.
Yeah.
When the children of Israel had been oppressed for a certain period of time, then God raised up a judge to deliver them from the oppression. And then it typically says, God raised up the judge, he or she did their thing, and then they had a period of rest
Right,
for a time.
right.
But it's during that period of rest that you have this, they degraded into their immorality again. So what y'all had a discussion here, what was going on, what came out of your discussion?
We can get the same number.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a chart in my Bible and it doesn't have Abimelech on there.
Yeah, see, I've always, and don't lose your question, I've always excluded Abimelech too, because he was a usurper. He was a kind of a bad guy. He was an illegitimate son of Gideon, I believe.
But
But anyway, he was a guy, go ahead.
why Samuel was not included, because he was one of the last of the judges.
Right,
But then I guess he's sort of thought of as a prophet also.
right. But I think he is referred to as a judge. It's just that he's not mentioned in this book.
He got his own book.
Yeah, he got his own book.
In fact, 2 books. In 2:16, it says the Lord raised up judges or leaders
Mhm.
who saved them out of the hands of these raiders.
Yeah. So what was the rest of your question, Lon?
Well, I was just wondering if their role grew as through the years. In other words, Samuel, we talked about, he would travel, kind of like, I don't want to say hold court, but he would go to
Right.
different places. And I'm wondering if these guys, they were just ready, the early ones were just more or less to unite the tribes to fight the oppressors. So I'm curious.
Yeah. And I think it was, because we see that in some of these judges, they were not people of great moral character, were they? I mean, you take Samson, he delivered the Israelites, but he was kind of a flaky kind of a character. And this guy, Abimelech, he's listed among them. He wasn't the greatest of guys either. But in this, we see that God has and continues to use flawed characters to accomplish his purposes,
That's what he does.
Yeah, amen for that. Amen for that. And we can.
On this, well, just say, this first line,
Yeah,
you got years of oppression, 8, and years of rest, 40, so you add those up, and would that be the time that Othniel ruled?
well, he was alive during that period of time, so the Jews were oppressed for 8 years by the Mesopotamians, as we're going to read. Then Othniel comes along, and he defeats them, and they have 40 years of rest, okay? And then you go down to the next line on the far left. Then the Moabites oppressed them for 18 years. Then Ehud comes along, he does his thing, and then there's 80 years of rest. But part of the reason I gave you this, you go through this exercise, you add up 111 years, 299 years, and that gives you what? 410 years. You say, well, so the duration of the book of Judges would be 410 years? No, it's really not. So what was it? Well, there's a couple of things we can look at. If you look, for example, in Judges 11:26, this is during the time of Jephthah, the ninth, I think he's the ninth judge. I wrote it down as 9, but that number may be off because of what I have here. It says, let me just read first. It says, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aor and its villages, and all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon 300 years, why did you not recover them within that time? So this suggests, and again, that's a round number, this suggests that the period of the judges was about 300 years, at least through the time of Jephthah. And so you could take that and you could add on the time frame after that. But again, that's not entirely accurate. So I've got to go back to some pegs, some more specific pegs that we have in the scriptures. And one of the questions I wrote up on the board, and this again is going to be one that I'm quite sure is going to be on the final exam. How long was it between the time of the Exodus and the commencement of Solomon's temple? Dun, 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 dun. I'll take biblical history for $50.
The Exodus was 446. It's on the board right there.
Now those are the dates. We're looking for the time frame. Yeah,
We can do the math.
They're all tied
Give us
together. Well, the math is given to us in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 2. It tells us exactly what it was.
You didn't
didn't tell us that.
180 years.
480 years, all right. So if it's 480 years from the Exodus to the time of Solomon's temple, we can do a little bit of math to tell us how long it was. So if we take, or after the Exodus, how long were we in the wilderness?
40 years. That doesn't even talk about years.
That's right down there.
First Kings 6:2, that doesn't say anything. It's the building of the temple and it's, okay, maybe it's 1 instead of 2. 480 years is 6:1.
6-1, I'm sorry. Okay, 6-1, First Kings 6. All right.
480 years after the Exodus.
So Exodus to the building of Solomon's temple. Let's back into this. How long were we in the wilderness? 40 years. Okay, good. Don't be shy. Everybody knows that. All right. How long did it take for the conquest of Canaan? This is
7 years.
all right. So the conquest of Canaan, and then for the complete duration of Joshua's reign, if you will, from the time we moved from Joshua into Judges, roughly how long was that? It said
Roughly 25 years.
25 years. That's what my math says. It's somewhere between 15 to 25 years. It's a pretty good guess. And we'll call that conquest and occupation. And that's, of course, when they doled out the land, the tribes were a lot of their portions, they came in. That's basically through the death of Joshua.
Yeah.
Through Joshua's death. Okay. So then we have the period of the judges here, and that's the big question we're trying to solve for here. All right. So we may need a calculator here at some point in time. All right. So then after the judges, we had the kings, and what I believe 1 Kings 6:1 says was in the 4th year of the reign of King Solomon, he began to build the temple. All right. So before Solomon, who was king?
David.
All right. Before David was king, who was Saul. Saul. Okay. How long did Saul reign, and how long did David reign? Okay. This is another easy one. Don't be shy. Everybody knows this. They each reigned 40 years. Saul reigned for 40 years, David reigned for 40 years, and Solomon reigned for 40 years. Okay. So roughly, plus or minus. So if we have Saul plus David plus 4 years of Solomon, how many years is that?
160. At 120.
No. We don't have all of Saul. We have 40 years of Saul, 40 years of David, and then just 4 years of Solomon, right? Because that's our reckoning point, right? So that's 84 years. All right, so we got 84. All right. So somebody add for us 40 plus 25 plus 84 is how much?
49.
Okay, I'm gonna round it to 150 just to make it easy for us. And then if we take 480 years and subtract 150 that we've accounted for, how much does that leave? 330, yeah. And there's your answer. Okay, the period of the judges was roughly, we'll say, 330 plus or minus. It could be as little as 320, but in round terms, the period of the judges was about 300 years, 330 years, let's say. Okay, now that's significant because for a good part of that period of time where the judges ruled, if you will, in Israel, how would you characterize those? Good times or bad times in Israel?
Up and down.
They're up and down, but
It was right in their own eyes.
that's it. That's one of the themes that we're going to hit on in the book of Judges is that things were not going on in Israel the way God planned for them to go on. It was a time really of moral degradation.
But it was all the people's fault when they got the bad judges.
It absolutely was. It was always the people's fault. It was not because God was going back on his promises. And as we'll see, it is principally because the people did not do and were not doing what God told them to do. God told them to occupy the land, stay in your place, and wipe out all of the indigenous people. And not just the people, wipe out what else specifically? All their places of worship. Don't leave any shrine standing, wipe them all out, get rid of the people, get rid of the practices, get rid of the evidence of the practices of false worship. Why? Because they were tremendous distractions. People, and what we're going to see here is that the children of Israel thought that they could satisfy God's command. God's command was wipe out all the people by doing a couple of things to them. One of them that they thought they could do to appease God is they thought they could take them as slaves. So they took some of the indigenous people, rather than killing them, they took them and they used them as their slaves. And they thought, well, God already satisfied with that if we make them subservient to us. But God wasn't satisfied, because that slavery didn't last too long until it turned on them. The people, if you will, escaped, rose up, and attacked them. Which gives us, I think, a very interesting spiritual message. Because very often, the same kind of thing happens in our lives. God wants us to enter into the sanctified life, which is what entering into the promised land is all about, claiming the promises that God has made for us. So we claim His promises. We say we want to enter into the sanctified life. And God says, all right, if you want to enter into the sanctified life, the promised land, destroy all your idols. All right? And so we say, all of them? Can I keep a few of them around? I'm going to keep a few of them around, and I'm going to keep them, but I'm going to keep them in slavery to myself. Right? I'm going to keep them in slavery. And guess what? All those idols in our lives that we don't destroy, even though we say we're going to treat them as slaves, guess what? They turn around and they cause us problems.
I think one of the biggest problems though is whenever the one who's left, they started intermarrying.
Absolutely.
That was probably one of the biggest reasons of it all.
Absolutely.
A lot of it started in Egypt. They was there in bondage for all those years. They started
Yep.
along with the Egyptians with their gods. Many
Yep.
gods they worshipped in the way they did, so a lot of it started there.
That's right. And they thought, it was okay back then, I guess it's okay now.
This is what continue on. They kept looking back,
Yep, that's right.
taking back the Egypt.
Yep. All right, so before we leave this, we're going to say that the period of the judges, then, just for our purposes, was roughly 1380 BC to roughly 1050 BC. 1050 BC is roughly the time that Saul first became king. Okay, so that's what our duration is. We'll fill that in on the board up there. But again, remember that, because that's going to be on the final exam. All right, let's talk about the themes. Wanda brought up one of the key themes in the book of Judges, and you can see if you turn to the very last sentence in the book of Judges, it's a pretty good synopsis. It kind of tells you the whole thing. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that theme is repeated several times. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I think about that, and I think about what's going on in the U.S. today. The idea here said there was no king in Israel. I don't think it was so important. I don't think that God is saying here that it's so important that you have a physical king, right? What He's saying is that certainly there was no king that was being recognized in Israel, but people were not seeking after the kingdom of God, were they? Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and then everything that you need will be added to you. So this is really the kind of the antithesis of what Jesus was saying. People were not seeking first the kingdom of God. They weren't putting God first in their lives. They weren't devoting all their efforts to being obedient, to doing exactly what God told them to do. Rather than acknowledging that there was an objective standard for righteousness and lawfulness, what do? They invented their own standards of rightness. And boy, how is that similar to what's going on today?
You can have an earthly king, but it doesn't mean he's a good one.
No, that's right. That's right. And the whole idea of having a king is seeking the kingdom of God. That's the right relationship of people to a king, seeking God's kingship in our lives. The earthly king doesn't much matter. But what they were doing is they were inventing their own standards for righteousness back then. And what do? They constantly went wrong. And you think back what's going on today. You ask the people in the know today if there is an objective standard for morality, and what's the answer? No. Even the Supreme Court has declared that morality is a very subjective thing. It sort of depends upon what the community says morality is, or what the community of a particular area says is the right or the wrong thing to do.
I heard a statistic, and I don't remember numbers because I don't remember that well, but the number of Christians, the percentage of Christians in the world is decreasing, and atheists and agnostics is rapidly on the increase.
Wow.
Again,
It
they're
is
doing what's-
sad.
doing what's fitting their own eyes.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, you can't embrace Christianity and then still cling to the desire to have your own way, right? It's just, the two things don't mix. And so what do people want, Just like the old Burger King commercial used to say, have it your way. That's what people want, have it your own way. So, that's why they reject Christianity.
But they see no profit in it, or financial profit, or any kind of profit. They don't see anything
Yeah.
benefit or good to it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. A couple of other things before we jump into the meat of it. If you look in chapter 2, verse 10, there's a profound statement that says, "And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel." And what a condemnation that is. Many preachers have talked about the fact that we're just one generation away from apostasy, and how important does that make it for us to teach our children and our grandchildren what they should know? I mean, that's a tremendous burden on us, because if we don't teach them, what's going to happen? The same
If
thing
you
here.
don't teach them, no one will.
That's right. They sure are going to learn in schools.
No.
And you think about the crazy things that are going on in colleges these days. Man, it almost makes you want to tell your children, don't send your grandchildren to college, because it's nutty. I was listening to news the other night, and they had this professor, I'm not going to name the university, it was a prominent university up in the Northeast, and this professor was giving his opinion on something. And then at the end of the interview, the TV guy said, "Now, what do you teach at this university?" And he says, "I teach a course in Beyonce." Can you believe that? And y'all probably don't know who Beyonce is. I didn't even know she's some sort of entertainer. But a college course in Beyonce?
For what purpose?
For what purposes, right? Just to collect the tuition is what it's for. And so anyway, praise God. You look in Judges chapter 2, verse 16, there's another theme. "So the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. So as evil as the children of Israel became, God still didn't forget about them. And when they cried out to him, he raised up judges to deliver them from their oppressors." Chapter 3, verses,
You didn't read 17.
read it for us.
Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them.
Yeah. And so we see the cycle up and down.
Yeah, but continue. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's fear.
Yeah.
Isn't that fair?
Yeah, very profound.
Just because they're taught right, don't mean they're gonna do right.
Yeah. And there's something else interesting that we have to keep in mind as we read through here is the reason why all these problems came about. And again, we'll study in more detail when we get to it. Chapter 3, it starts off by saying, "Now these are the nations which the Lord left." In other words, the indigenous people, they left to do what? To test Israel by them, in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war. So the sons of Israel might be taught war. And then it says in verse 4 again, it says, "And they were for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses." So here we see something pretty interesting, because it says, God gave the command to the people, particularly through Joshua, go in and destroy everybody. Well, they didn't do it. We see that as a shortcoming of the children of Israel. But God said, either God said or God knew that they would be unsuccessful, that they wouldn't do what God told them to do, that there would be some of these indigenous people left around there. And God says, you know what? I left them there to test you, to see how well, even in the presence of these distractions, how well you follow me and how well you listen to me and focus on what I'm telling you to do. Again, they are a very profound spiritual message. Here we are, we claim to be Christians. We desire to live a sanctified life, and yet we have all these distractions in our lives, all these things that we should have driven out. God says they're there what? To test you. To test us what? To see how much time we'll spend with these distractions as opposed to spending with Him. And then the other thing He says that's very interesting, He says, I left them there so that the sons of Israel might be taught war. You think, why would it ever be necessary? Why would God want His people, any of His people, to learn war? What do you think?
Well, if He told them to drive them out, He wanted them to be prepared.
Right. Right.
Well, we have to do battle every day,
Yeah,
and we need to know how to fight those
right.
enemies.
That's right. We need to know how to do it. To teach them war, I think, was the idea of not teaching them a battle plan like they had for Ai, but rather to teach them the battle plan that was laid out for Jericho. Big difference, right? And what was the battle plan for Jericho?
Listen to the Lord.
Listen to what God tells you to do in His timing and do exactly what He tells you to do, no matter how unorthodox or unbelievable it may seem to be. Wait for God, listen to His plan, and then carry out His plan, no matter what happens to you. That's what He wants us to learn about the methods of warfare even today. Not to develop our own battle plan, not to rely upon our own strength, but to rely upon Him to fight and win all of our battles, because He will, and He can.
I sure hope He's gonna be involved in the one in Korea, North Korea.
Yeah.
That could be a big one.
It's going to be very interesting to watch how that unravels.
Well, Jesus is coming, so we don't have any worries, really.
We've already won. We are more than conquerors. That's right. You read the end of the book, didn't you?
I did.
So you know.
That's cheating on the train and going around.
Okay, with that introduction, we got a little bit of time to start reading in the actual text. What we're going to see, and you probably observed this too, if you read Judges 1 and 2, much of it is repetitive of what we read in the book of Joshua, and you're also going to see that this is out of chronological order, because when we close the book on on Joshua, Joshua was dead, right? He'd given his last speech and he died and they buried him. Well, here we're going to talk about Joshua. You know, sometime he's alive and then he dies again. His death is reported again. So anyway, so just remember as we read 1, 2, and even 3 that it's not in chronological order. Ann, would you start reading for us there? Judges.
Judges,
Judges, chapter 1, verse 1.
At the beginning.
At the very beginning, that's right. That's right, you can't be skipping to the end all the time.
After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who will be the first to go up and fight for us against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah is to go. I have given the land into their hands." Then the men of Judah said to the Simeonites, their brothers, "Come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours." So the Simeonites went with them. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek.
Pause right there. You know, they're talking here about after the death of Joshua. But this is something very similar to what happened really in the very beginning, because remember, the tribe of Judah got their land first. So we don't know if it's talking about then or if this is another fight that occurred afterwards. But at any event, it's a different account, and there's something that's told that we didn't know before. Ann, read on, please.
It was there they found Adonai Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and Perizzites. Adonai Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes.
Pause right there just a second. You say, what? They did what? They chased after this king and they cut off both of his thumbs and both of his big toes. But they didn't kill him. What's that about?
The big toes is your balance.
Right? So they cut off
For running, yeah.
from a physical standpoint, what would the effect be of cutting off somebody's thumbs and their big toes? Yeah, they wouldn't be able to fight against you, right? They wouldn't be able to hold a sword, and they wouldn't be able to run. They had their big toes cut off, all right? So basically what they did is they got him and they disabled him. And again, that's another violation of what God said. You know, they may have thought, well, we're being merciful to do this, we're going to let him live. But God said, no, wipe him out, and especially wipe out the kings. But what do? They take this guy who represents, I think, a distraction, a sin, a potential problem in their lives, and rather than kill him, wipe him out, they disable him. Now, is that something that we have a tendency to do with the distractions in our lives? We don't want to get rid of them. Sometimes we're satisfied, well, you know, God should be satisfied if all I do is disable him, but I leave him around. God said, no, don't do it. Do not be tempted to do that. That will be a problem to you later on. Everything that's a distraction, everything that's going to be an idol to you, that's going to take you off your course, God said, get it out of your life, totally out of your life. All right, read on. Tom, you want to read from there?
I'll pass.
Pass? Sarah, you want to read or pass?
Oh, sorry. Seven. Then Adonai Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have packed up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem and he died there.
Oh, right there. So, you know, one of the reasons why they did this to Adonai Bezek is because he had done this to 70 other kings, right? So it's kind of payback. But at any rate, that's not something that God was satisfied with. All right, read on.
The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem and also Bethel. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. After that, the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev and the western foothill. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron, formerly called Kiriath-Arba, and defeated the Shishak, Ammon, and Talmah.
Okay.
From there, they advanced against the people living in Debar, formerly called Kiriath-Sepher. And Caleb said, I give my daughter Asha in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath-Sepher. Can you, on these words, I won't pause and you say it, because you said it.
I'll do my best.
All right, go ahead.
And Othniel,
Son of
Kenaz,
Caleb's younger brother took it, and Caleb gave his daughter Asher to him in marriage. One day, when they came to the Othniel, she urged him to ask for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what can I do for you? She replied, do me a special favor. Since you have been given me the land and the Negev, give me also springs of water. Then Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs.
All right, pause right there. This is something we read before, okay?
Right.
We said, well, why is that there? What does that demonstrate? And Lon told us the story. The daughters continually ask their fathers for things, and their dads always give it to them. This proved to us that some things just never change over thousands of years. And it happened back then. So here we're introduced again to Othniel, who is Othniel?
He was the nephew of Caleb,
Nephew of Caleb, and also what?
his son-in-law.
His son-in-law. But then what's his significant in the book of Judges?
He's the first judge.
He's the first judge. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I was sitting in a Sunday school class in my grandmother's church in Flat River, Missouri, in Bill Ford's Sunday school class, and he asked us, he says, asked my brother, he says, who was sitting next to him a year old, he says, tell us about oatmeal. And my brother, of course, he was struck down and says, oatmeal, it's my favorite breakfast food. And I'll never forget that. Over 50 years ago. And it's totally irrelevant to this, but it's kind of humorous. It's amazing how those things.
anyway.
That's right. So oatmeal was my favorite breakfast food and the first judge of Israel and the nephew of Caleb. And we all know who Caleb is. Favorite friend of ours. All right, who's going to read next? Lon?
The descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Canaanite, went up from the city of Palms with the people of Judah to live among the inhabitants of the desert of Judah in the Var near Arad. The men of Judah went with the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, and attacked the Canaanites living in Zephath, and they totally destroyed the city. Therefore it was called Hormah. Judah also took Gaza, Ashkelon, Arad, each city with its territory. The Lord,
Of course, Gaza and Ashkelon, that's where the Philistines were. We know that. Read on.
the Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possessions of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots filled with iron.
All right, Paul's right there. Yeah, that's an excuse that's given. That they couldn't drive them out because they had iron chariots. You know, that is no doubt the excuse that the children of Israel gave, but that would be no excuse insofar as God is concerned. God is not deterred by horses or iron chariots. So the people were trying to come up with reasons why they didn't drive out the indigenous inhabitants, but none of them were very good. All right, read on.
As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove it from the three sons of Anak. The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites lived there with the Benjamites. Now the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. When they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, show us how to get into the city, and we will see that you are treated well. So he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but spared the man and his whole family. He then went to the land of Hittites, where he built a city and called it Luz, which it is named to this day.
Paul's right there. Again, this is another example of the children of Israel not wiping out the inhabitants, and it continued to cause them problems.
But yet that's very similar to Rahab.
Well, in a sense, except the difference, the fact that Rahab provided help to the children of Israel was one thing, but that was not her salvation. Remember, Rahab's salvation was when the two spies came to her, what did she say?
She acknowledged the Lord.
She says, your God is the God of heaven and earth, and I've seen the great things that he has done. So basically, she engaged in a form of worship at that point in time, and she, in essence, entered into a covenant, right? So what do these guys do here? Yeah, they provided some help, but I don't think that was enough. I think God still wanted them to be wiped out. All right, verse 27. Terry, you want to read from there?
But Manasseh did not drive out people from Beth-shan, or Tamek, or Dor, or Ibleam, or Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land.
Pause right there. When Jack and I were in Israel, we went to Beth-shan, we went to Megiddo. Megiddo, of course, is the place right in the valley is where the Battle of Armageddon is going to take place. Beth-shan is an ancient city. Now I've got a picture of it up there, but it's one, if you look at the very bottom row, the column is second from the left. That big hill there, that's where Beth-shan was. Beth-shan is where the body of Saul and his sons were nailed after they were killed. But it's an ancient site, and it overlooks Beth-shan is at the intersection of the Jordan River Valley and the Jezreel Valley, a place that's been strategic militarily for thousands of years.
You say that's by Saul and
Saul.
Benjamin, or what was this? I think his son's name now.
Jonathan,
Jonathan, thank you. It was Jonathan.
Yeah,
No, Jonathan was killed earlier,
but that was his son.
you know,
Yeah.
but
He was killed at the same time as Solomon.
he was.
I think that's right.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, that's another story for another day. All right, this is a good stopping point. All right, we'll pick up here next time. Any other comments on this before we go? All right, again, a very, very interesting history that we're going to study about in Judges, and very, very profound spiritual truths here that apply to us even to this very day.